here today, and thank you for the opportunity. It is something in our agency who deals with employee assistance and workplaces across New Zealand. We have a particular heart for not-for-profits, and we're a very values-based organisation. And so we look forward to growing alongside Prostate Cancer Foundation in any way that we can, bringing our people with your people and with those who we can assist in groups. I guess when Graham asked me to share something of interest perhaps today, I thought it's what my contribution is a little bit different actually but I thought I'd just keep it really simple and draw upon a model and a concept from my workplace experience, which I feel confident to talk about. Just having gone for many years across organisations, working with managers, working with individuals and teams, and one of my roles that I played was a transition support person for 18 months through the Super City arrangement in Auckland, and I came across a model that actually was extremely helpful for me in being able to put together a framework for people to understand their reactions. And so I thought what I'm speaking about today is nothing about myself. It's actually I want to refer and just share with you. Some may already know about the SCARF model, which is fantastic if you do, but really it's a model that is it was put together by David Rock and a team. They were a team of neuroscientists who gathered together at their symposium in London, put out a whole lot of research, brought it back together to try and understand a little bit more about how the brain works in social systems. And what was particularly interesting was that when you think about, we just come to work. I come to work to do my job, to earn my money, to get on with things, but actually from a stepping back and understanding, even here today, we're all fellow journeyers. One of the things I just believe in being very real and very human. And today we're here, and I hope this makes sense to you even because we're all human beings who have to cope with change. We're talking about when our lives can change quickly and things come at us, and this is very much our brain registers a workplace, for example, as a social system. And understanding that affects, if we understand it a little, in my experience, helps us understand ourselves, our communication with other people in our teams, communication with the leaders, and even in fact how we perform ourselves. So it's about a social system. So social systems across our society, obviously everywhere, workplace, home, schools, and general social events. Even thinking about coming here today is a social experience. And for some you might think, what's this going to be like today? It's very human kind of reaction. So the SCARF model actually provides a framework for understanding the 5 dimensions which our brain responds to. And it was really good to understand that right since year dot, human brain's been wired to respond in 2 ways. Either imagining a continuum, and at one continuum there's a reward response, and at another continuum there's a threat response. And it's all about the way our brain perceives things. The perception is the key because it actually will trigger immediately within seconds a response, either a positive response of wanting to move towards something or wanting actually to get away from something. And so, as you can see in social settings, if we are uncomfortable or feel uncomfortable, we actually want to get away from the things that make us uncomfortable. On the other hand, if we're drawn to something, we actually want more of it and we want to embrace that. And I found really fascinating to understand that the social needs, actually the brain circuitry for responding to social things is the same as the areas of the brain that actually respond to the really physical things. So if I'm socially threatened, somewhere in my brain has a similar response as if I'm physically under threat. And even that if there's a reward response, say towards in a physical sense, or I'm going to, have more money or something tangible, then that will be the same circuitry that is if we are going to have a positive social in a social setting. So it's very interesting about how we're wired, really. So this is just a really little summary of the what the SCARF model entails. And so SCARF, obviously, what they have done is made a model that is really easy to remember. You know, the SCARF model. And so each of those, obviously, S for status, C for certainty, A for autonomy, R for relatedness, and F for fairness. And you can see by the size of the arrow which the most powerful response is the one where we want to get away from something that's unpleasant or that we perceive may be a threat to our well-being. So I'd just like to take a moment and go through these different domains and just explain them. And I approached it through a workplace context. And particularly when I heard this model, it was in an organisation that for 18 months had been knowing that it was going to cease to exist. The people who'd worked there, for many of them, sometimes 30 plus years, they did not know if they had a job, they didn't know if they had a job, what it would be, who they'd be working for, and which part of Auckland it would be. So there was multiple threats, actually. And when I actually went to the workshop of David Rock, I found, to be honest with you, and being very real, it reduced me. I had tears welling up in my eyes because suddenly I could explain in a very non-emotional way to men, particularly, and to women, why they had such a profound response and why they were under such threat that had gone on for a long time. So status, of course, is about, it's all about, I want to come back to perception. It's how we perceive things. So perception is about our status is about how we perceive ourselves in relation to other people. Certainty, being able to, concerns to be able to predict the future. Autonomy, we like to feel we've got a sense of control over events and we've got some choices. And relatedness relates to how our social network is put together and how we see ourselves in relation to that. And obviously fairness, whether there is something is perceived to have been done right. So just say a little bit more about each of these. And so the where the reaction occurs is obviously, I'm not a expert on the brain functioning, very much a layman in many ways, but find it fascinating just even to understand, you know, the difference with the limbic system and the amygdala when that's what's triggered when we're under threat. It's the part that triggers and controls our human behaviour and will trigger that fight-flight response that we have. In contrast, that prefrontal cortex, where our intellectual capacities and functioning takes place, the problem-solving parts, and they become inhibited when we become under a threat response triggered by the amygdala. And so often it's really interesting just to understand why I can't think, you know, at certain points when something happens that really affects us with a profound emotional response. And then that also gives us the ability, one of the positive things about this whole model is that it gives us a model to be able to label our responses, to understand them, to label them, in one sense to even predict them, and to be able to have a cognitive reappraisal of a situation that might be potentially threatening to us. So if we think about status, how we see ourselves in the world, how we see ourselves in relation to other people, then, you know, when I took it from a work perspective, because that's my world that I know, and I see people, even, for example, going through, having to go through their performance reviews, knowing what will that be like? How am I perceived by my boss? How am I perceived by the organisation? How am I perceived by my colleagues? If we do a 360 review or something like that. Also, most hugely I see this operating when we do a lot of work in supporting organisational change, people who go through mergers or downsizings or whatever, or restructuring and aligning things to the organisational needs, and where roles are affected. And like as it was, as I said, in the Super City was really significant. And so people's status is actually, and how we see ourselves, is very important to us. And also even in conversations, if we are afraid that we're going to look bad in front of somebody, or we feel like we're in a place of discomfort where we may not be perceived positively, our brain can very easily elicit a threat response. So status is just something about being human. Also, in terms of certainty, our brain likes to have certainty. We are wired with a brain that likes to predict patterns and the familiar, and we like to be able to predict what's going to happen next, and then our brain functions well. It's like we've got a library of experiences, and when in our familiar, we can, as it were, perceive a situation. Yes, it's familiar, I can handle that, it gets filed into my known experience. However, sometimes, we resist mental effort around decision making because often it takes brain energy, and if we're under threat and not sure about what's going to happen next, the brain will use more resources in that prefrontal cortex to process moment-to-moment experience, because uncertainty can be very threatening, particularly if it has a potential number of layers of impact. So we have status and we have certainty. And autonomy is really, how many of you, we like to feel we're in control of ourselves and of a situation, if we're real. Now, sometimes I think it's a bit of a myth because so much of life brings us things that we're not in control of. But I think we have a human desire to want to be able to be in control and manage things, and to have opportunities to choose things. And so if we feel that, like, for example, in a stressful situation, if we feel we've got options of how to deal with that, then we'll actually handle that with a lot less stress than if we're backers up against the wall and we've got no choice. And so autonomy is an important part of our human need. The relatedness, R for relatedness in the SCARF model, and is very, very powerful. All of these actually are powerful, but the related one I see so much as a human need is to connect, is to be able to feel that I'm valued in the workplace or in my life, or my community, in my home. And the ability to feel trust and empathy for others is shaped about whether we are perceived to be part of the same group. Interestingly enough, if we look at how many of you have been to a social situation that you're actually quite uncomfortable with, and you go to a party even, I don't know anybody there and I'm out of my comfort zone, and they all seem to be talking to each other, everyone knows each other, they're really comfortable, and I don't fit. Well, there is a physiological brain response to that, and it's interesting about that huge need for human connection that is so real. And so, interestingly enough, the brain, if we perceive something or someone as really different from us, the brain circuitry around that will be really different than if we perceive someone to be like us, because like us equals safe. And it's really interesting. And it's a strong perception of whether we are in or out of a group, and it's all based on perception. And an example might even be in a workplace. If a manager regularly goes to morning tea or afternoon tea with the same group but excludes other members of the team, suddenly the people who don't go start to feel like he or she has favourites and I'm on the outer. It's all about perception, and it's very, very human, as you'll probably relate to. So once people begin to make social connections, interestingly enough, the brain begins to secrete oxytocin, which will minimise and lay to rest something of that threat response. And it allows those neural pathways that build connection and becomes a reward we want to go toward, not something we want to get away from. And so trust and empathy are built through this. And, it was interesting taking a workshop on Friday with a group of team leaders who don't actually relate that well to each other. And the topic was courageous conversations, how to have courageous conversations in the workplace. And what was really interesting part for me, before we could talk about that, I felt it really important to be able to talk about how we feel. Do we feel safe? Do we trust these people? Can we say how we feel? Because basically, if that's not there, then we're not going to be able to do that. So it's interesting in interpersonal settings to be able to look for ways that increase similarity and connection. And I was thinking about that here, and especially yesterday too with the coordinators group, that there is a connecting reality that brought everybody together with the Prostate Cancer Foundation and the support groups. There is and how powerful that is. So relatedness is really important. It's about whether I see that I'm sort of accepted and part of that, or actually I'm on the outer and I want to get away from it. And of course, fairness, really basic, but actually, do we perceive that something's been done right? And, when there's a perception of unfair exchange for whatever, it will elicit in us a strong reaction. This is not right. It's a real threat response. And it is one thing that absolutely undermines trust and collaboration. And in my workplace work, I really see that one of the most important things is about consistency of treating people the same if you're a leader or a manager. Because, so like status, perceptions of fairness are relative, and settling differences requires awareness and acceptance of others' perspectives. But so we have the SCARF model, SCARF, the SCARF model. And again, it's a really simple summary, but I often think if you stop for a moment and you just thought, when's a time I've been really upset in my life? When's a time that I was really uncomfortable and I wanted to get away from it? And I wonder if you just stop for a minute and wonder which one, if not all, those little buttons were pushed. And when I was, for example, in that council, working with a council support role, their status was affected. They didn't even know if they'd have a job. Many people lost senior jobs. They had absolutely no ability, no certainty. They couldn't predict what would happen because there was a huge downsizing. They had no autonomy. The government made the choice it was going to happen. And so when it came to, there was and relatedness, I was part of a council that was seen to be smaller and less perhaps well positioned than the bigger council, and so they felt quite a little bit like this in terms of response and the way that many perceived that there were things done that weren't particularly fair. So when I was reflecting on this model, I realised that for many people, every single one of those buttons were pushed, and it was not. They wouldn't have even had a choice about responding like that because they were such innate responses that were triggered, and it just was hugely helpful to people to realise. So I'm not weak. So I'm not silly. So I'm not coping. No, this is human behaviour that actually put a language and a framework to understand why I'm so gutted, actually, and why it's so hard. And so I thought, and actually in thinking about this, I realised that if you think about it, sometimes when we have a major diagnosis of our lives, which ones of the buttons of those are pressed? Well, when I was thinking about it, potentially every one, because it's the unknown, and the unknown is very, very frightening. And so what happens in workplaces or in life is, with threat and reward, we often, when someone's under threat, a whole lot of negative behaviours will begin to emerge. And so when, for managers, I wanted to explain this and have done to managers to be able to say, when a person is resistant, when a person is stuck or negative or cynical or sarcastic, and what was interesting is not that they won't problem solve, but actually they can't because they're so stuck in that threat response. And when they are not getting on with people, rather than being a judge or a critic, why not try and understand and actually ask yourself which of those, what's happening for that person? Because if those threats aren't actually addressed or talked through or managed, then people become disengaged. In other words, they They might be there with their bottom sitting on a seat, but actually they're not. Their heart's not there, their head's not there. They're kind of minimalist. And it's a horrible place to have in a workplace. And you contrast that at the other end of that continuum when it's a positive work, where there's openness and trust, and that people want to go there because actually we do a great job, we get things done, there's energy, creativity and productivity, and that's engagement. And to go from those who are disengaged to a place of engagement takes skill and real effort, and it is small steps, it is not automatic like that. And so really important for those in leadership to understand how they handle situations, and just understand it, that actually that's normal human behaviour in groups, and a workplace is just a particular type of group with a common focus and outcomes to achieve. But it applies to all of our organisations. It applies to social gatherings of any kind, so whether we want to be there or not, and whether we don't. But just interesting to stand back and reflect. Threat responses are much more powerful. The desire to get away from something uncomfortable is very, very strong. And we move away from threats more quickly and vigorously than we move towards rewards. It's a very strong human response. And so what we can do, what I felt about the SCARF model that I thought was really helpful, was that in many ways it helps us to predict when I'm going into this situation, what's it going to be like for me, so I can predict how I might respond or how others might respond. During an experience that's really challenging, I can remind myself why I'm reacting like this. I can name it. And when we name and label things, strong emotions, it begins the process of our brain beginning to process them and work through them. And I found it quite interesting hearing him say that the research showed that because the physical the brain experiences social threats the same as physical. David Rock explained that actually that when we address things like Panadol for physical pain, actually it will help our emotional pain because it affects the same brain circuitry. I thought that was really interesting. So I've thought about that. But so thinking about how we can take control of situations and how we can understand, and during them how we can regulate, by labelling things and being able to use our cognitive ability to reappraise something and tell ourselves the truth about it, put it in a context. All those are very useful things, because once you know something, you can take control of it and actually begin to work with it. But also, you know yourself, when someone is extremely stressed or extremely under threat, it is very contagious. And certainly in change processes in workplaces where there's a lot of fear, it's very contagious, and lots of rumours and things that are very unhelpful occur. So I just thought it might be useful to share this tool. It's a little model that's so easy to remember about the SCARF model, and I just really hope that it might be something that you can think about for yourself, understand why people react in behaviours, even in support groups, when new people come. How do we make sure that we minimise the threats and maximise it to be a reward experience? Simple things like a smile and an outreached hand. Making people feel they matter and that they connect, and that they're, just trying to minimise their threat responses. So in workplaces, for me it was important with managers and leaders when dealing with people, to take care when we deliver messages, our language used, the kind of tone we use, and, work to reward the positive wherever you can, and to build up people's status needs. I don't mean in a patronising way. I just mean, let people know when they do things well. And that when people feel good about being in a work environment or in an organisation or in a group, the levels of productivity and outputs will be just so much higher. And so also giving people as much certainty as possible, and being honest and real. And sometimes it means you can't get away from hard decisions that have to be made in an organisation or even facing an illness. But what you can do is at least acknowledge that this might be difficult and you can expect to feel this and this, and to give people as much certainty as possible and as many options, and all of those things really help. And giving people people love to, it's important. We talked in our women's group about knowledge gives power, and giving people choices and knowledge, that is a very empowering place. It still might be a very difficult road, but knowing that I've got choices is one of the things that can reduce a threat response. And the importance of actually caring, giving positive recognition, positive feedback, and just, the basic fundamentals of respect and being authentic, and, together that not minimising that hard things happen, but actually realising that together, if we understand and respect each other, we can work through very big things with support and the right care. And so all of those above things, they create a reward response. So I hope it seems a bit funny to share this at the conference, but actually I felt it was about life, and it's about understanding ourselves and understanding others. So I think in summary, our goal with people, with us, look to see ways that we can make people feel genuinely good about themselves. We come in a culture often that we're very good at bringing down the tall poppies, but actually people respond more to praise and, to where we can increase certainty and give people choices, help people take control as much as they can, work on including people and reaching out to them to make their experience of coming into groups a positive one. And of course, let's try and do things right. So anyway, that's probably me. Thank you.